Good evening. Good evening and welcome very much to Conversations, where I'm pleased to welcome to the program Robert Ashford. And Robert Ashford is a professor of law at Syracuse University College of Law, and he's also a long-term student, friend, and a proponent of the theories and thoughts of the economist Louis Kelso. Has written a very interesting long article called Louis Kelso's Binary Economic Democracy. And Robert, welcome very, very much to Conversations.
It's very nice to be here. I'm very glad.
Wonder if I might, maybe perhaps for the general audience who is viewing, they might be familiar with Louis Kelso's most well-known development in terms of the American economy or world economy, the Employee Stock Ownership Plan, the ESOP. There will be many people, Avis and Weirton and other examples, people will be aware of that, but they might not be so well aware, and perhaps they really ought to be aware of the fact that behind that thinking of the ESOPs, there is a whole economic theory called binary economics that has tremendously important implications as we begin to think in terms of how we might be able to structure our economy and our economy within a world economy in an entirely new and different way. And I wonder if maybe you could share with us your understanding of what do we mean when we say binary economics, and what is the quintessential sort of essence of what we mean by binary economics, which sets the analysis of Louis Kelso and yourself, if I may say so, apart from virtually all of the economic theory that currently is utilized by the world leadership to attempt to operate this planet, spaceship Earth of ours.
That's quite an opening. That's right. Well, it's a great question, and it's hard fully to say what it is without doing a little bit of groundwork to say what it isn't. It is a new idea, and when you think about how many times we learn new ideas, it is new. That I'm convinced.
In a paradigm shift.
It is a fundamentally new idea, in the sense that going around the Earth is different. The sun going around the Earth is different from the Earth going around the sun. That was a new idea. Pasteur had a new idea. This is a new idea. Now, it may not be a correct idea. I think one can suspend judgment on that, but it is fundamentally new.
It ought to be given a look at.
It is absolutely. It is, and I think it's an important idea. It is neither a capitalist idea, as that term is traditionally understood, nor a socialist idea, nor is it in between. We have this sense of a linear spectrum where we have left wing and the right wing, and if something is not one of those two, people begin looking in the middle.
Or we have some people saying we have trickle down, or we have tax and spend, which is the language that currently is going now after Mr. Clinton announcing his new plan and so forth.
This is beyond. This is really beyond that idea. Louis Kelso used to describe it as an idea in terms of the independent productiveness of capital. Traditional economic theory, left, right, or center, if you get to the mathematical rigor of it, it all boils down to some function of productivity, which is output per unit of input. That's a mathematical concept. Even the socialists that in other ways may disavow their notion of capitalism, they would concede that there is this function, it's productivity, and that's the mathematical rigor that traditional economics claims. Louis Kelso's economics is based upon a different concept, and that's called productiveness. It's also a mathematical concept. It may be not easy to get into this discussion by plunging into that too deeply, but that gives it a new idea. And there are implications of that new idea. The implications of that idea are that if you focus on productiveness rather than productivity as your fundamental driving a mathematical variable, and if you re-examine what we mean by a property system, an open property system versus a closed property system, then you come to the conclusion that the scarcity that we're experiencing in our society is an artificial scarcity. Far beyond, artificial and the plenty that we could have is really far beyond our present dreams. That's why I think it's a very important idea.
If we had an appropriate kind of institutional, economic institutional structure that could begin to relate to the technological realities that are emerging. Productivity is usually measured in most people's mind as the combined production of the economy divided by labor.
So it's output per unit of input.
And it's usually related to labor in most people's mind, and the distribution of income is done by a labor relationship to production, whereas the binary principle, I think if I'm not mistaken, encompasses the idea that there are in fact two factors of production. There is labor, And there is the non-labor components of that, including land structures, contractual advantages, patent rights, and technology and so forth, and that is an independent factor of production and should be given credence in terms of trying to build an economic democracy and some ownership of that technology into the general society, which is not the case now.
That's correct. Now, when you talk about that, though, I think of people who understand traditional economic theory, and they will be leaping to the phones to say, well, we do give account to capital, and there are equations. But I think there's an important sense in which you examine in a totality, in a foundational sense, how the traditional economist analyzes growth. It ultimately boils down to human productivity. And capital, although it is given some sense of independence in some areas of the mathematical analysis, in fact, it all boils down to productivity. So you could say, we take as a maxim, that there are certain ways you can get growth. You can get growth by increasing productivity. You can get growth by greater investment, which perhaps will trickle down into the job market. And you can get growth by lowering your transactions costs. But that's it, folks. That's the end of the ways.
What exactly do you mean transactions cost for the audience?
The cost of doing a particular transaction.
Okay.
For example, if you can imagine the transactions cost of a banking system that we have today before the computer age. You couldn't have the complicated banking system. We've reduced transaction costs so you get more output. So there are traditional ways. Now, Keynes also talked about the problem of aggregate demand, so that there's the sense of, well, if we redistribute and if we sort of prompt the economy to stimulate the demand side, that we can get growth in a different way. But Lewis Kelso's concept of growth really goes very much beyond that. And it holds that there is a principle of binary growth, and that is the more broadly capital, like you say, land, machines, structures, patents, trademarks, the contractual arrangement, the more broadly capital is acquired in the economy on market principles, then the larger the economy will be, irrespective of gains in productivity, irrespective of the size of the capital investment, irrespective of how much it trickles down in terms of jobs, irrespective of lowering your transactions cost. It is an independent growth factor. Now that's either true or false. It's a fact claim. And if you analyze the history of thought, nobody has made a case for this kind of a relationship that I know of in all that I've read, other than Lewis Kelso. It is unique. I can't tell how many times I've gone to the library after talking to someone about it. So, well, that's sort of like what so-and-so said. I'll go to the library. And it isn't. I mean, one can dismiss this idea, and traditional economists have. But one thing is clear, it is new. It's distinctly new.
The traditional economist and the traditional thought pattern is, again, back to that heliocentric or geocentric. There were all kinds of people who had arguments, even elliptical patterns of the planets, as you pointed out, that fit very nicely into a geocentric view of the universe. The only problem was that it was really a heliocentric universe we lived in, and there's a great contradiction or problem that does arise in that. But it is a genuinely new idea, as you say. Again, it's not left, it's not it's not right. It's not center. It's a genuinely new idea in that heliocentric, geocentric concept. And it might be that it's this genuinely new idea that we want it to be considered in terms of that led Mortimer Adler, the very, very preeminent, in many people's minds, philosopher and disseminator of knowledge in our society, to say this is the most important idea of the 20th century, which is quite a statement for a man of that distinction.
Considering he's surveyed, his job is to survey all the new kinds of ideas.
So it's in that line, or in that sense, that we would like to have the idea considered. And what it is relatively simple in some terms. There are two factors of production, and we should take that into account. You said earlier that you would have a binary economy would be able to meet the demand or needs of an economy. If we were to look at and divide the economy into those who have a labor relationship to it and those who have a capital ownership relationship to it, isn't it fairly true to say that on an individual basis, those who own the capital, which is becoming increasingly relevant as we move into robotics and microprocessors and so forth, those who own the capital and have that capital relationship to it is relatively small in terms of the overall population?
I don't think that anybody has offered statistics that show that the number of capitalists in any economy exceeds 10%. Now, what we mean by a capitalist is somebody who earns, let's say, a minimum 60-70% of his or her income from capital.
from the payments of the capital?
From the earnings of capital. I mean, let's not talk about capital. I believe in capitalism, but I haven't got a bit of capital. That's what a person believes. But a capitalist, in a behavioral sense, no economy, as successful as Germany and Japan and the United States, none of those economies have produced populations where a significant portion, anywhere than 10% of the people, live most of their lives on the earnings of capital.
Yeah, that's right. Most people don't even think in terms of gaining income for meeting life's purposes by something other than having what we call a job or a labor relationship to it, or, increasingly, transfer payments through government taxation and distribution.
And traditional economic theory fundamentally says it doesn't matter who owns the capital. That is to say that the idea of spreading capital ownership as an independent good that will produce a growth in and of itself. The traditional economic theory is not mathematically wired to comprehend that proposition. We are a bit talking, like the heliocentric and the geocentric, we are talking a little bit about the vase between two faces.
Yes, the famous.
Is there two faces looking at each other, left and right, or is there a vase in between? Well, there's nothing in the organizing vision of the two faces that will let you see the vase in between by logic.
Yes.
And so when you're in your opening comments about how there are two factors of production, I can hear traditionally economists saying, well, we already account for that, and it's almost as though someone says, well, don't you see the nose there, and don't you see the eyebrows, and we're saying
because they're taking PhDs and defining those eyes and very well on that face as they talk in traditional terms. And it's good to underscore we're talking now about not only it's the Marxian analysis or the neo-capitalist or the capitalist tradition, the Keynesian, the discussion, much of the discussion. And we all wish him well, obviously, and would hope we can, move things along. The discussion that is taking place in these town meetings with President Clinton, most of the discussion, one never hears any mention at all in that. It seems to me, I listened to the whole thing, but it's all defining the faces and never looking at the vase. Yes. And the only one who does that is Louis Kelso. The question of who owns this technology, which is increasingly responsible for production.
Now, there are people who do talk about ownership, and there are ownership movements, but again, to the extent that people do not have a comprehension of his theory, we are really talking about a very different sort of notion, because when he talks about ownership, the other thing that's new about him, we haven't really talked productivity versus productiveness, and we need to do that.
Yes, we want to do that.
But the other thing that is new is that it is a fundamentally distinct system of private property. That is to say, our present system of private property is wired so that almost all new capital ownership is acquired by existing owners. It takes money to make money is the adage. It's a little bit superficial because this is not a monetary issue. This is an issue of real capital, real productive power. But our property system is wired so that you need capital to participate in the capital markets to acquire more capital. If you don't have capital, you can only participate in the labor markets. That's the rule, and most people end up poor in that process. The traditional analysis has produced lots of workers and just a few capitalists. The other thing that's new is that Louis Kelso's system, it's the binary system, the binary property right, enables everybody to effectively participate in the capital markets, to buy capital on competitive terms where the capital pays for itself, and then to receive the full earnings of that capital in perpetuity. That is a right, and it's not simply a panaceic wish if his logic is correct, and I don't see a flaw in his logic. It is an inevitable consequence of wiring the private property system to recognize that everybody has to have a right to acquire capital on terms where it'll pay for itself and then enjoy its income.
Yeah, particularly as we begin to move into an increasingly technological oriented world, and it can begin to you take the logic of business finance, which is, as you say, make an investment in plant and equipment or in a business investment, which will pay for itself out of its future earnings. That's the logic of business finance. If it's not going to pay for itself, it's a bad investment.
That's right.
But if it's going to pay for itself out of its future earnings, that usually pays for itself in maybe 5 to 7 years, something of that sort.
Rule of thumb, 3 to 5 in good years, 5
and
to 7
the only people who have been able to, in a certain sense, self-insure themselves against that loss are those already with the capital stock, as Mr. Smith might have said. So it's those who have the capital are able to make the investment and to realize the ownership of that 5 or 7 years out and then have that process grow
need a
to where
property
maybe
system
5% of the population tend to own it all, and there's a heavy concentration of ownership at the top.
Lewis Kelso's theory is that if we let everybody play that game, we will reduce the barriers to entering the capital markets, we'll make them more efficient, and we'll actually get a growth. Now, I think, in a sense, now is where perhaps we need to talk, what do we mean by productiveness and productivity?
Yeah, okay, yeah, right.
Have a little bit of sense of that. And I have 3 examples that speak of it, and every one of these examples do cause consternation to traditional economists, because they're going to focus on how it doesn't make sense for the eyes or the ears or the eyebrow
of
their
the two
vision,
faces, and you're trying to define
I'm trying
the
to
vase,
get them to see
the
it in a
vase.
slightly different way. So let's assume a person can dig a hole in 4 hours by hand, which schematically represents sort of the Stone Age. And that's Stone Age technology. You use your hands. You dig a hole.
You have no tools, no technology,
You just
no
dig
capital.
a hole 4 hours with your hands. You've got bleeding fingers to boot. That's,
right.
Eventually, somebody discovers a shovel, and there's the principle. It's a scrape. It's first of all, may just be a rock or something, but eventually, the idea of using tools. And
let's call it a shovel.
A shovel. The person can do it just to simply in 1 hour rather than 4. Now,
okay, it took them 1 hour to dig the hole. I mean, it took 4 hours to dig a hole. They get the shovel. Now they can dig 4 holes in an hour.
No, four holes in 4 hours, or 1 hole in just a quarter. In just 1 hour.
Yeah, right.
One hole per hour.
Yeah.
Or 4 altogether. So the shovel now enables them to either produce 4 times as much in the same time,
right? Oh, I
or
see.
the same thing,
right?
In just a quarter of the time,
right? Okay.
And Lewis Kelso used to say the purpose of the Industrial Revolution is to put people out of work.
All right, that's
to
interesting.
Give them leisure.
In and of itself,
and
right.
we'll come back to that idea,
right?
Because our strategy, the job strategy, is to put people in work, and Lewis Kelso said you're fighting something because the purpose of technology.
Well, that's because the only way we have to distribute income is through labor. Right.
So now, but there's another way of looking at that. If you look at this productivity notion.
Yeah.
And then the economist will take the first derivative of productivity, which is a way of getting its marginal, how much it produces on the margin. 1 more unit of labor will produce so much more. And there are fancy theories that show you that this will produce the kind of bounty that we see in the United States, let's say in Germany, Japan, versus the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. It's this productivity function that we focus on. It's a ratio of output per unit of input. Very few sciences are built on a ratio, by the way. The Kelso view is that you have to look at the capital as an independent producer of wealth. And you could say there's something else about this. You could say that the productiveness has changed from 100% labor productiveness, which is the pre-tool situation,
right,
to 25% labor productiveness and 75% capital productiveness.
That would, in a certain sense, more accurately reflect the reality.
The work done in the particular instance.
Well, in that sense, the reality that the shovel is there.
The shovel is, you only have to do 1 hour. And it's actually more, because when you figure you don't have to bandage up your hands and everything. In fact, the work has gotten easier. Yeah. Even in the hour that you're working. Yeah. If you only want to produce 1 hole. So productiveness looks at the idea, and it focuses on, in the traditional context, of what we call capital labor substitution. But before we go down that traditional analysis, it's important to recognize that in the binary terms, the most important thing that capital does is not make labor more productive in the productivity sense, but to replace labor productiveness with capital productivity.
All right, now that's a fundamental thing, and that's also tied into the binary principle, right? There's 2 factors of production: labor, and all these other things other than labor. And yet we have a society where practically everyone concentrates, for the vast majority of the policy decision makings and so forth, upon the labor side. And the general society ought to wake up to the fact that, don't you think, it seems to me, ought to wake up to the fact that this,
people need to participate on the other side of the equation.
Need to participate on the other side of the equation, and own some of the means of production, rather than concentrating only upon wages as a way of their having income to meet life's purpose. Now, Lewis provides that.
That's right. He provides a way of doing what we now think is impossible. I can anticipate objections from a traditional economic view on everything we're saying, but it's important to suspend those and get the whole thing out. Right. One of the tragic things about Lewis Kelso's existence, and basically he was extremely successful. He was a marvelous innovator, and his ESOP is all around the country and in many ways. But one of the saddest things is that no one ever debated him in his own terms. And I guess in part I come at this as a lawyer. And that is to say, we have to understand the idea first in its own terms. After you understand it in its own terms, then you can disagree with it. But you have to get all the cards on the table. So let's do the second.
And the lawyering community, as I can, has deferred to the economics in terms of trying to understand it without building a prima facie case or testing the basic premises of traditional economic thinking the way they ought to in order to be able to bring their skill and also meet their professional and ethical responsibilities in terms of helping to build a more just and equitable society, because it's the middle and lower class people who are being most hurt by this, although the whole economy is. But that's an important legal question.
It becomes a property issue. Now, let's give a second example. Let's suppose a company has, turn of the century, is an elevator company, and it simply owns 10 elevators, and it makes its money by bringing people up and down different floors.
Yeah.
Chief financial officer goes to the president. They're manual elevators, and they're really hard to pull these levers.
They still have some of those around. You see them, right?
So chief financial officer goes to the president and says, well, if there's a new technology, if we invest in this new technology, automatic elevators, what we saved in labor costs, we could make up in terms of the interest. We would pay interest, borrow the money, invest in these elevators, but we save the labor costs. Well, and up net ahead, we depreciate the elevators over time, so we have current elevators even when the old ones wear out. President says, well, I'm kind of a conservative person, let's try it with 5. So they install 5 automatic elevators. Well, are the remaining operators now twice as productive? Or is it more important to recognize that capital productiveness has replaced a half of what that labor productiveness was providing before? And now the labor productiveness is cut down to half of what it was before.
Yeah.
And then if this technological adventure is sound, it'll happen society-wide. So you now have nothing but automatic elevators. Are the operators now that are either on welfare and job, are they now infinitely productive with respect to the elevator? Or is it more important to recognize that the elevator has total productiveness of the automatic elevator, the capital, has totally replaced labor productiveness. So that gives you a new way of understanding poverty.
Yeah.
Let me just give you one more example. Let's suppose that someone can haul with great effort 50 pounds in 10 miles.
I'm not sure I could do that,
but somebody
maybe.
does.
I might. I mean, when I was young, you know, but I mean, I don't know if I can do that now, you know, but all right. Let's say that. All right.
Now, he domesticates some donkeys.
Yeah.
And now it can haul 5,000 pounds in 10 miles in the same time.
Or has a truck, is another example.
But I think they're donkeys now. Okay. Now, is the person now 10,000% more productive? Or is it more important to recognize that the donkeys are now doing 99% of the productiveness of a vastly expanded output?
Yeah.
I mean, how homocentric it is to think that the human being has the productivity increase.
Well, they will
Isn't it important to recognize that the donkey's doing the work?
Well, I know, but then you're going to get into the animal rights people. I'd almost rather have it be a truck because it's inanimate and it's, you know, but in any case, I understand exactly what you're saying, and you're going to get a whole army of people who are going to be coming and saying that this is, looking at it in terms of productivity, they're going to say, oh, well, the person has become that much more productive, guaranteeing or providing the basis for them to have what Mr. Clinton might say, high-paying, high-wage jobs.
Now, the traditional theory is that all this technology produces more jobs than it eliminates, and that is, and there are economists who are prepared to prove this to you today.
Oh, yeah.
All I can say is suspend judgment and see where this logic takes you. I want to say a priori, if we were philosophers,
well, we are to a degree.
Or if we're serving the public as lawyers, a priori, from the basic assumptions, there's nothing God-given that says the productivity description of the relationship between capital and labor is somehow much, much more important than the productiveness. One is a ratio of quarter, and one is takes it in a different way, looks at a percentage of output. But a priori, there's nothing more important about productivity than productiveness.
No, particularly if we're trying to get at some sort of a policy that makes sense, and if we also could take within our mind, as many people do, within the American economy now, there's such tremendous interest in the economy. These town meetings that they have and so forth. People are interested in it because they feel at a fundamental level a sense of uncertainty about things. So qualitatively new propositions and ideas really ought to be part of the public dialogue rather than our going on almost like a sacerdotal class discussing the traditional terms by which we've done things.
So that's right.
You know, to introduce a new concept.
And then to understand that the resistance to this new concept is basically taking something on faith. There's a sense in which The only reason why Louis Kelso's theory is not considered is because it is based on productiveness rather than productivity.
Yeah, and all of the other economic theories are based on productivity.
Or attacking productivity for some political or institutional, some other. I mean, it's fine to build attacks that way, but this is a different approach.
Yeah.
And what kind of a legal justice system will we have if I come to you with an argument that you're the judge, and I start my sentence and I say, I want to talk about productivity, and you say, well, that's fine, but it sounds like productivity, so I'm going to consider everything you say in terms of somebody else's story.
Well, I'm certainly that's what they did.
No justice system. There's no hearing.
I'm certainly that's what the Inquisitioners or whoever it was would have said to Mr. Copernicus. You know, they would really set it up in terms of those old terms. But I wonder if we could set another kind of or another thing here is that productiveness of that technology changes through time. In the early Stone Age, we had very little technological extension of conscious capability to do things. But now the technological development with microprocessors and robotics and all of these things has been building for a couple 100, 300, 400 years with the Industrial Revolution, but those are all moving exponentially, and the ratio of productiveness that is on the side of technology as opposed to labor, if you put a percentage between those two, it's hard to do because they measure everything in productivity terms. But if you were to do that and attempt to get a measurement of that in some,
intuitive sense,
an intuitive or an abstract sense, or just to look at the world, that technology is becoming increasingly in real terms responsible for production. There's one chart that you had where it might be like
that.
It goes in a curve up, and it might be as much as from Tom Jefferson's day 10%
to 90%
labor to maybe 80, 90% is the result of technology owned by 5% of the population. So there's a schizophrenic or inherently built-in mismatch between the way things are produced and the way income is distributed.
There are traditionally econometrics that will prove to you that the sun goes around the Earth and Jupiter. I mean, there's an internal mathematical coherence that says that's illusory, that things are really, the value of labor is going up, and that these constant shares are all mediated through the labor.
Well,
but I don't. I'm just suggesting. I'm acknowledging
all of the people in the institutions with labor being the source of distribution have an interest in trying to reify that principle, because that would try to justify them to get a better paying job.
When Samuelson justified not considering Kelso's theory, he called it a crankish fad. When Samuelson did that, his basic argument was the consistent measures that labor claimed so much of the total pie on a consistent basis, about 80% at that time. And in essence, that is simply an assumption that the market is competitively pricing capital and labor, whereas and that Kelso's foundation must be not taken seriously because of that. Well, there's two problems with that. First of all, if you get into traditional economic theory, there's lots of dispute as to whether we have efficient markets and the degree to which we have them. But just theoretically, the first premise of an efficient market is open entry. Open entry into the market. We don't have open entry into the capital market.
95% of the people participate not at all.
Are not able to participate. Now, the traditional economist says, well,
in the market.
When we well entry, traditional economists say, well, if we can find 7 good producers, big heavy hitter corporations, then we must have an efficient market. I mean, it's kind of like a scientist. Like, well, that's 7 molecules of air into the space, and if it's in which will expand, we must have a good atmosphere. I mean, there's the premises necessary for competition is real open entry, and we don't have that. So here is Samuelson saying we will not consider this theory because fundamentally our markets are competitive enough for this. And Kelso is saying, but the markets are closed. And Samuelson is saying, it doesn't matter who owns the capital.
But I think most people intuitively would sense that the market is closed because most people don't even think in terms of making investments in capital by which they're going to realize a significant portion of their income. The only source of income in most people's, for 95% of the population, is they will have what we call a job, a labor relationship to that, or they will have transfer payments from the government.
People are demanding the wrong thing. You demand jobs and welfare, and that's what you get, jobs and welfare.
And yet perhaps 80% of actual production is the result of technology owned by maybe 5% of the population. So we have a fundamental mismatch, and it's very undemocratic.
Now, up to now, you're probably seeing something, up to this point, except that it never focused, you're probably seeing something very similar to what Karl Marx saw. That's this problem. But Karl Marx didn't have a market solution, and what is remarkable about Louis Kelso's solution is it's a market solution. So let's see if we can sort of recapitulate. We now have productiveness gives us something new. It gives us
As does binary, yeah.
Productiveness gives us a new way of explaining why people are poor. People are poor in an industrial economy and are not fully participating in all this vast output as they could, not as fully not because of jobs, they lack a job, or because they're not on welfare. They are poor systemically because they have not acquired over time, on market principles, the capital productiveness that has replaced labor productiveness. That's the concept that is new in this binary approach. Without being able to acquire the capital productiveness that replaces labor productiveness, the aggregate labor claim on total production will decrease as capital claims more. But now there will be some redistribution. We'll tax capital to enable labor.
Governmentally. That's called tax and spend.
We'll do more pay for less work.
Yeah.
So that's fine.
So that's increased wages.
That's right.
And then they become sycophant to the institutions that are embodied by the capitalist, with some people at the top, necessarily.
So now we've only stated the problem. And now the question becomes, is this productiveness way of looking at things, is it more than simply a new way of looking at something, but is there a solution? How can people acquire the capital that replaces the labor production?
And build an economic democracy. We have a political democracy, we have a vote. I mean, even that's limited and truncated in many ways. Town meetings are being called for now and so forth. But not to build an economic democracy to match the concept.
And that's a very another...
Because we have an economic, it's fair to say, given the realities, and I think people would recognize it, we don't have an economic democracy, we have an economic plutocracy.
That's what Lewis Kelsey called it. Now, and when we talk about democracy, there's another element of that I think is a nuance. I don't know that it is as foundationally new, but it's an important observation that the Kelsos, Lewis and his wife Patricia Hedder-Kelso, continues to work in this area.
Yes, of course.
And that is that when we talk about democracy, the first thing we think of is majority rule and protection of minority rights. That's sort of the notion. But Lewis Kelso's concept of democracy and Patricia Kelso's concept is widespread, universal, individual participation. You almost have to say the word widespread, universal, individual participation in production.
To build autonomy into the individual, the way nature produces.
Now, when people think of economic democracy, they think of workers getting together and voting about where the water cooler is going to be or what the job conditions are, and those are very important, and what the wages are. Now, to the extent that that's a political decision, and if you want to operate that way, that makes sense. But the economic participation is participation in the income of capital. The only real reason to own capital is for its income, for its economic participation. So Kelso is talking about individual participation in capital. And that in participation in the capital markets, it will have the remarkable effect of creating even more growth because you open the barriers to capital. Now, I think
that would be what you might call that binary growth in terms of the macro view of the economy, because you're going to have a distribution of income by capital ownership, and that's going to create the demand, or to allow Say's law, if people who study Adam Smith or Say's law, that is going to allow the demand to be built to have a larger economy. And we have been having trouble in our economy because we don't have the demand to purchase that among the general society, to purchase that which we're fully capable of producing.
We've been killing our consumers.
We have to build demand and supply at the same time.
You kill your consumer when you replace capital productiveness for labor productiveness and don't enable the people whose labor productiveness has been wiped out to acquire that capital productiveness. You destroy your own consumer. Now,
and unfortunately, this is building toward an economic democracy. That could have been a collectively bargainable point. You know, they could have been the labor union movement would have had some clout, and people who were be able to think beyond 6 months or something like that, be able to think 5 years out or so that this is going to pay for itself. It could have been collectively bargainable that the workers could have become owners of corporations, and just in a general sense, for people who are concerned with the society, it could be collectively bargainable. If we're looking for a new social contract in this country, that the people could be able to insist that they become owners and begin to have some ownership of the means of production.
It still can
and yet they don't tend to do that here within the normal economic dialogue that we hear on our in the press. Generally.
And it still can be, and I think the labor unions can easily exercise that influence if it turns out that they see this. I mean, we have, and I think it's important though now to look a little bit about this idea of binary growth and why it is we say that if you look at productiveness and see that that's a new way of explaining poverty. And if you look at
that does exist.
That does exist. And now the question is, how do you get this binary growth, and how can it be done? Well, another principle that Kelso offers is the idea that if capital will buy itself for the rich, it will buy itself for the poor. If the elevators will buy themselves, elevator shovels and anything that you create, including what it takes to maintain them, if they will buy themselves for the rich, they will buy themselves for the poor. The problem that you have is, what if the investment fails? Now, our universal practice in the context of failed investments is we look for the equity investor to sustain a risk of loss, and that risk will enable the banker to make the loan on the capital, for their capital, and then we have a sound banking system because it is covered for its loss because the individual entrepreneur is sustaining that loss. Now, Kelso's
and they would want collateralization in order to be able to do that.
Kelso's proposition is that the cost of business failure, systemically, we're talking still on an aggregate basis, the cost of business failure can be insured and included in the cost of the product and the service. That there is a just like we insure for casualty insurance, you can insure for systemic business loss. Now, let's start off, if we look at this from the point of view of the participation of each individual in the capital future, and the participation individually, not as a group, but individual participation. Look at America's 2,000 largest companies. Now, some of them are going to fail. There'll certainly be some remergers and some consolidations. But nobody believes, or at least nobody, no government operates under any serious assumption that America's 2,000 largest companies are all going to go under. That is to say, if you look historically, the investment risk of America's 2,000 large companies is an insurable proposition. That's Kelso's argument.
Well, we already have, in a certain degree, if we start looking at the too big to fail principle. We bailed out collectively the Chrysler organization and other kinds of organizations. We did it for the large ones. In many instances, isn't it true that we've done that collectively, or put the full faith and credit of the United States government behind that?
We already
too big to fail concept.
You could argue that since the New Deal in this country, and historically maybe earlier in other countries, that the government stands behind its largest corporations. And it simply finesses that risk politically through the monetary policies and through the fiscal policies and through the taxing policies, rather than attempt to price it in the market, which is the Kelsonian approach. Now, but I think now, before one judges whether that this is an insurable risk in a market sense, and I'm willing to suspend judgment, let's just put it on the table and look at it. I think it's important to look at binary growth. Let's assume that a certain portion of the capital requirements of America's 2,000 largest companies is met through a ESOP-like situation, whereby corporations find that they need to invest in tools that they believe will pay for itself in a competitive period of time. So the managers make that decision, and instead of floating stock, which only sells that capital to existing owners, or using retained earnings, which only sells that stock to existing owners.
Which is the case now.
Or borrowing money for the benefit of existing owners. Instead of doing that, we enable the loan to go to a trust, which invests in the corporation, which now has the money to invest in the tools. And now the profits from the adventure now are contributed to the trust to enable the trust to pay back the loan. So let's say in 7 years the capital is paid for itself.
All right, now that's the
capital
binary
acquisition,
and that's also the binary time frame.
Well, that's the first part of it. That's right. So let's say in 7 years, America's 2,000 large companies, some of them have done well, some of them have done poorly, but in the aggregate, the capital investments have paid for themselves in a period of 7 years. Not an unreasonable assumption in decent times, and even not so bad times. It's not too bad of an assumption. Now, in the 8th year, this capital, 1 year's worth of capital is fully paid for itself. All the income from that capital now goes directly to the new owners. They may be employees in the company. They may be citizens within the state where you've privatized something. They may be welfare recipients who otherwise are eligible for welfare. So if we politically
include them within this process, which is perfectly able to be done institutionally, as a way of addressing poverty problems.
So now in the 8th year, capital is paid for itself and it's producing an income. Let's suppose the rate of return that year is 10%. So there's that income is now spendable. Now, had the rich, the super rich, earned that money in the 9th year, 2 years, in the 10th year, 3 years.
Right. It grows.
In the 15th year, 14th year, 15th year, you now got half of the new capital over this period of time that has been financed through binary financing and is now owned by you and me, folks. And now they spend that money. Now, if the rich had owned that money, they would look around for more investments.
Yeah, because they can't possibly spend more.
How many Mercedes can you buy?
Yeah.
But in the context of a lower consumer demand. So looking at it in, let's say, this 14-year period, this binary time frame, you see a situation where you anticipate more market-based demand. Now, managers that anticipate a big market in year 7, a bigger market in year 7 or 8. The ones that don't begin tooling up for that in year 5 are going to be left out.
Right.
You already have a basis to perceive more market demand earlier. Not only that, but some people who have a combination, they have a little bit of savings, but now they're beginning to expect their capital to come online, and paying them income. Individual consumers will have more confidence in their future, so they can spend some more. So you're going to now over the long haul, 15, 20. If you look at within the generational situation,
and we need that kind of generational responsibility to begin to manifest itself.
So you now have financed over a binary time frame, supply and demand.
Right.
So it's not a trickle-down theory. Binary theory rejects trickle-down economics at its core. It says it's fundamentally unsound.
And it also rejects
it is not a demand-side theory. It is not simply saying, let the government decide, stimulate things by spending, taxing or borrowing on the future or monetizing to create a demand which is insufficiently generated through the markets. It's neither a supply-side organization nor a demand-side organization in terms of the
it subsumes them both.
It is supply and it is simultaneously, and the Kelsos have a word for that, simul-financing.
Yes, right.
So now if there is a growth here, we're still willing to say, well, maybe there's not, but if there's growth here, let's pause for a second.
Added growth because the demand is there to buy those things.
Because you have linked incremental productive power in the first half of the time frame with incremental consumption power in the second half. Now, if there's growth, let's pause for a minute. This is growth that is not the result of any increased productivity. We haven't said anybody's going to work smarter or harder or more. It is not because there has been more capital investment. Nor is it because you've lowered transaction costs in any conventional sense, although you could say you have lowered transaction costs because you've linked people directly with productiveness rather than having it siphoned through the labor structure and the welfare structure. So you could make, but the fundamental engine of growth is that the distribution of capital, who owned it after it papers out, is for the people expected to buy what it produces. And that is a new growth connection. This may be smoke and mirrors. It may be some reason in traditional economic theory that will show that I've been studying a mirage for 20 years. Perhaps so. I'll concede that. But let's first examine it.
Let's bring it out on the table and examine it and bring it out into the public. And in order for that to happen, it would bring into public consciousness to the fact that there is this possibility of them having this alternative relationship to the economy other than simply wages.
So this now steps into the argument of left versus right. And it really says that entire debate misses the big ball game. Both the right and the left, as this argues now, is all affirms the proposition that your only gains are from productivity gains, or your only gains are for more investment, let it trickle down, or your only gains are for the government deciding what we ought to need.
And it also might be able to subsume these historical patterns that we've had within a context that can begin to have us be future-oriented rather than past-oriented, and it is also one that would, if one begins to think of increased capital formation that might be available for us to utilize within an economic sense, be able to be a system that could allow us collectively as a human society to begin to investigate the proposition that collectively we are transcending with proper design and so forth, we are transcending the ironclad rules of fundamental scarcity which has been the scourges of scarcity, which have plagued mankind throughout the generations and the thousands of years, and may be able to open upon a technologically augmented, well-designed capability for us to operate this with ecological safeguards and design built into that to build an ecologically appropriate new operating system for this very fragile spaceship Earth of ours, and begin to be looking ahead toward an opening upon sufficiency or even a surplus capability that collectively we we have. As we look at all these exponential curves going up, we need some new system other than the historical pattern which we've inherited.
Kelso saw two kinds of scarcity. Physical scarcity, which he acknowledged as real, and which is conquered, in a sense, through technology. But the other scarcity is institutional scarcity. That is to say, it is the closed system which excludes people from the capital markets, which forces the laboristic distribution, which kills this distribution-based growth. It is the failure to link incremental productive capacity through property rights so that the full income of that incremental productive capacity after it has paid for itself is linked directly with the people expected to consume the next round of goods and services.
Yeah, it has such a logic to it at a certain level that one thinks it gets a little frustrating when you hear them talking about the old way. It offers an economic
It's a market solution.
A market solution, but an economic democracy that could be also a political democracy. It helps answer some of these fundamental questions that so much of the nation is concerned with now. It offers an alternative perception which we don't see, and it's one that is progressive in a certain sense, but it is also one that is offering a new relationship of the general society, an economic democracy. I'd mentioned to you, I'd been in, there are very few examples in that. They do have, in such strange places, even there are some places which have a new situation, even in a country like Libya, where in Libya they have a thing, partners, not wage earners. They're beginning to build partnership and private property owning a capability into the people that is, in a certain sense, following upon some of these principles in a halting kind of way. But there could be other places that could begin to build into this. It doesn't have to come only from the United States, and it does also have worldwide implications, the basic principles behind this idea of building a binary or a partnership, not wage earners economy.
Many people see the problems, and what we're seeing now, you're absolutely right, what we're seeing now is something that there is a groping for ownership. I think that the difficulty, and for me, and the frustrating thing is that I think that Louis Kelso adds a further degree of clarity and foundation that will make all of the groping. It's like little dots in the picture. You finally connect enough of them.
Yeah.
And there's no doubt in my mind that any country that is interested in the kind of partnership that you're talking about, particularly one that has some resources, that any country that does that will create an economy of healthy consumers and will outstrip in growth. That was others. Now I speak this,
and perhaps set a model that others could follow, because we need to have people begin to accept some of the basic premises in order for us to get out of the sacerdotal discussion of the old paradigm and begin to move into a new paradigm. Don't you think? Maybe a model from outside our country might be one we could repair to, or we can build it from within.
Anybody, I think, who is open for the change, and that's
and to think new, synergistically, new possibilities that we may not have given a consideration to.
There's two other observations I'd like to make about what you said so far. My understanding of this, my undergraduate training is in physics, and mathematics, on that side of the coin. And to me, yes, there is a rigor to this. And one of the ways you judge, in scientific terms, a good theory is by how many times whether you have to keep on revising it to make it make sense. Now, there once was a time when stagflation was a theoretical possibility. And then we got stagflation, and then you have all the economists go spinning to sort of explain what it was. Now, Louis Kelso did not have to change one. He didn't have to. There was no epicycle. He predicted stagflation, it's a logical consequence of productiveness analysis. It's not a logical first-run consequence of productivity analysis. He predicted in the early 50s, when we were at the high noon, the heyday of American capitalism, nothing can stop us, that their time will come when jobs will be wrung out of the economy like water is wrung out of a wet rag. And people just blinked. And what is remarkable now, and that's why the situation where people are struggling for, is that people are beginning to see that his predictions are coming true. He didn't predict when, because when this happens is a question of whether technology gets so productive that you can continue to do things through the redistribution process. But he did predict it, and so I think it's important to recognize that when you judge a theory, its simplicity and its elegance and its predictive power are very real. There's nothing that Louis Kelso has to revise in terms of his predictive notions.
Right, and if people were to be presented that, they would wring their hands and say, "This is terrible because it's going to create unemployment, which would create the worst kind of suffering, human suffering, because there's only this one way for them to have income, and we've wanted to try and increase the employment and everybody relating to production by employment." And yet, if we had a perhaps second economy, or if we had a second vision in a certain sense, where a mass-produced economy and the needs of a mass-produced economy, which increasingly, even if you go to Charles Chaplin, Modern Times or whatever, is increasingly robotized, is increasingly technological, the mass-oriented production process and so forth, can do more and more of producing of mass goods and services for the economy, with one where people have ownership of those robots, and that there are ecological safeguards and the capital formation that allows scrubbers and other kinds of appropriate design capability to be built into that mass production operation of the economy, and you're still building ownership into the people. That then would give them a flow of income from the ownership of that mass-produced economy that could give them leisure and at least basic economic capability, and perhaps even surplus, affluent leisure capability, for them to do what it is that they themselves feel they want to do without the stringent controls of economic wage slavery or economic ties to that, so that they could be concerned with things that really are of the human spirit, art, poetry, and the other kinds of things which no machine can do, the things that the human spirit does have. It could be liberating in that sense. And
that's the purpose of technology, is to
and that
liberate
is in a certain sense. It was Aristotle, wasn't it, in Politics, who said that?
Yes, he
Lewis
did.
refers to that.
He says the way he justified slavery is that you need slaves because man is made for a higher order. He called it man. We should say men and women are made for a higher order, and that we need slaves to support that. But he said if the lectern could play itself, and if the wheel could spin itself,
and the weave could loom, the loom could weave by itself.
And he really, it was a foreshadowing. Now the other,
that's Aristotle in Periclean Greece, 5th century.
Kelso is Aristotelian.
Yeah, right.
Definitely.
Okay, yeah.
Now the other thing that's important, another aspect of this that's important to understand, because is that there is no command in a binary economy other than the command to honor everybody's acquisition rights. That is the basic. This is not a state system that says make so many widgets or so many gadgets. All you do is set up the basic infrastructure, enable corporations to finance their capital requirements in this way, enable authorized lenders to make loans if the loans make sense, plant a legal foundation for the emergence of private capital credit insurers, create a government reinsurance corporation.
Okay, we hadn't mentioned that before, but this would be something that could be done by our political leadership.
You pass the laws up. You pass the laws, and we can talk a minute about the government reinsurance notion. It's not a government guarantee. It's a misconception. But you simply enable the process to go. And if private parties choose to do this, we will get the binary growth that we have. That is to say, this is entirely an autonomous private operation. But companies that are looking for ways to be good citizens, if they suddenly have a stable, decent way to encapitalize their employees, to encapitalize their consumers, to encapitalize the residents of the plants in which they live, this can be done voluntarily. And if lenders can make money in this way by making these loans, if the capital pays for itself, this process will go on. In other words, there's no mandate.
Well, it would it not open up? It would open up, in a certain sense, new capital formation capability for us to do what it is we technologically and in a design sense have, including ecological addendum. And it would do this, and it would do it by in a manner that would distribute this income to the general society, and it would do it within a way where they could be insured against the loss.
The individual worker or welfare recipient or whatever, they take no individual risk for this. They can't afford to take a risk. They're living paycheck to paycheck. But the people involved in the company management that are making the decisions have a risk if they make the wrong decisions. The bankers take a risk. There are trustees for the ESOP, which, by the way, could be elected by union representatives if it's a union situation. They have an obligation to make sure we don't get a flighty investment. And we need the same rigor that makes the rich richer. That working for the poor as well.
This is a system that could be able to benefit the middle and lower classes without
taking from the
disadvantaging the well-to-do.
If you get binary growth, you get a larger economy.
Yeah, you get a larger economy.
Everybody
so
can
it wouldn't
participate.
crowd out those who have had that advantage. It would just bring others in and create a larger economy. And it would be that it would be also with this system of commercial casualty insurance, an industry that could be built to assure against loss with these special trust funds that are created for these ESOP finance or these binary financed activities, with a government reinsuring capability behind that, in order to assure
that get very uneasy when you talk about
all right, well, they should be, but it could be discussed, something brought up in order to assure against loss for the lesser numbers of people, would make it possible to build this ownership into the entire population of the country, rather than only those within a corporate enclave or within an ESOP itself.
We could build ownership, individual capital acquisition.
We could begin to build ownership, and there are 7 other of these financing techniques that are there.
Kelso's done all the work. It's all there.
Kelso had done all the work and laid the groundwork that could be considered by policy decision makers if they could begin to start thinking in terms of this alternative system.
But you got to get over the idea
other
that
than
if it
looking at the faces.
But you have to get over the notion that if you can't rationalize it in terms of productivity analysis, it's not worth talking about. One has to suspend that belief long enough.
And unfortunately, that traditional. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's that. Let me just say.
Yeah, we're just getting down to the last couple minutes. So
Let's say that the people like Paul Tsongas that have talked about the intergenerational issues, saddling our next generation with debt. Yeah. This is the opposite. We are capitalizing our next generation with productive capital.
This might be one way of addressing that problem in terms of a possibility that people of good conscience, Rudman, Sogman, and a lot of other people, of good conscience are groping for ideas. For that matter, Mr. Clinton.
Yes.
This argument could be addressed to Mr. Clinton.
Growing the economy with binary capital.
Yeah, in the name of economic democracy. This could be addressed to any person of good conscience as we grope for some new ideas given and be able to maybe create a system that could help us. I use it a good deal for people who watch the program, but James Joyce at one time had a character say, history is a nightmare from which we're attempting to awaken, and this might be an economic financial organization that would permit us to be able to awaken from a nightmare of scarcity-laden principles that have kept us in the unhappy situation that we've been in throughout history and are the basis of many of the problems that we confront today if we look at the current situation. If people are interested, they're able to communicate with you. And I wonder, you're at the Law University or the Law College at Syracuse University.
Yes.
And anyone who would want to be in further communication are free to communicate with you there. Right? You'd be happy to talk to them.
Send them a paper or try to get them to understand it. Sure, I'd be glad to help. I think it's a new idea. It is susceptible to imperfections. That is to say, it's not a panacea. These government entities are as easily corrupted as others. There's really minimal government involvement in this. But the question is not whether it works perfectly or not. If we judge that, we should have no system. No system works perfectly.
Yeah, right.
If you judge the system that way, the question is, will it work better or worse than our present system? It never got a hearing in his lifetime. It ought to get a hearing now.
Yeah, and the important thing, as you say, it ought to at least have, as you say, a hearing rather than be just ignored by the economics discussion and the traditional thinking. It is a little bit different of a turf problem of your Keynesians, because you're in a certain sense asking Keynesians, Marxians, classicists, all economic schools to stop and rethink about those two faces that they're defining so well and try and look at the vase in the middle. And it's important, and I'm glad that we've been able to have you share these perceptions with the cable audience here in New York City. And Rudy, thank you very, very much.
It's a pleasure.
For coming in. And I would remind you in the audience then that it's been your pleasure to have the perceptions then again. Robert Ashford, he's the professor of law at the College of Law, Syracuse University. He'd be happy to hear from you, and he's the author of many interesting papers and pieces on binary economics, Lewis Kelso's binary economic philosophy. Thank you very much for viewing. Bob, once again, thank you very, very much for coming in.
Pleasure.
And good night. We'll see you next week.